Heal your inner child. These 4 words carry more power than we often realize. Inside each of us lives a forgotten version of ourselves, innocent, sensitive, and deeply emotional. This inner child didn't vanish with time. She hid. She adapted. She learned how to survive in a world that didn't always understand her. But she never stopped feeling. Never stopped longing for love, safety, and validation. And the truth is, she's still there. Right now. Shaping how you love. How you trust. How you react when life feels overwhelming. Carl Jung, one of the most influential minds in psychology, believed that this hidden self, the inner child, is the key to unlocking our emotional freedom. That without acknowledging and healing this part of us, we remain fragmented, trapped in cycles of pain, fear, and self-abandonment. But what if you could change that? What if everything you've been searching for, self-love, peace, clarity, emotional strength, wasn't somewhere outside you, but buried deep within? In this video, we'll explore how Jung's timeless teachings, combined with ancient Zen wisdom, can help you reconnect with your most vulnerable self, and finally begin the journey of healing. So if you've ever wondered, why do I keep attracting the same painful relationships? Why do I sabotage my own happiness? Why do I feel like I'm not enough, no matter how much I try? This isn't just coincidence. It's your inner child calling out to be heard. And the sooner you listen, the sooner you'll stop suffering. The symptoms are often subtle. You feel anxious without knowing why. You crave approval, even when you know better. You feel triggered by simple things, but can't explain the reaction. These aren't random emotional patterns. They're echoes of a wounded past, of a child who wasn't fully seen, protected, or loved. And here's the truth. Time alone doesn't heal emotional wounds. Silence doesn't erase pain. Avoidance only buries it deeper. Carl Jung taught that what you resist not only persists, but grows stronger. And in the case of your inner child, every time you deny her voice, she fights harder to be noticed, often in the form of anxiety, depression, or self-sabotage. But there's another way. A way to truly heal your inner child, not by reliving the past, but by meeting it with compassion. Not by blaming your parents or circumstances, but by choosing to become the adult that child needed all along. This isn't just about therapy. It's about integration. It's about reconnecting with the parts of yourself that you left behind, and giving them space to exist again. Zen Buddhism teaches that healing begins with presence. By observing your emotions without judgment. By witnessing your thoughts with curiosity, not criticism. And by creating space within you where even your most wounded parts feel safe. When you combine Jung's psychological depth with Zen's spiritual stillness, something profound happens. You stop reacting blindly. You start responding consciously. You realize that you are no longer the powerless child, you are the healer. And this shift? It changes everything. By the end of this video, you'll understand why your inner child still holds the key to your self-worth, and how healing her is the first real step to building a life of emotional freedom, deep relationships, and lasting self-love. But more importantly, you'll learn how to begin today. So stay with me, because this isn't just another video. It's a turning point. And maybe, just maybe, it's exactly what the little child inside you has been waiting for. If this resonates with you, make sure to subscribe. Every video here is a step deeper into your healing journey. In the field of psychology, few concepts are as deeply transformative as the idea of the inner child. This isn't a metaphor or poetic invention, it's a psychological reality rooted in our earliest emotional experiences. Carl Jung, one of the founding fathers of analytical psychology, believed that the inner child is a living presence within the unconscious. It holds the imprints of our past, our first moments of joy, but also our earliest experiences of fear, rejection, and confusion. Many of the emotional wounds we carry into adulthood are not from recent events, but from unresolved pain rooted in childhood. These early experiences form the blueprint of how we understand love, build relationships, and perceive our own worth. When left unacknowledged, this wounded part of ourselves doesn't simply vanish with age. Instead, it silently influences our choices, our behaviors, and even the way we speak to ourselves. Modern research in trauma psychology confirms what Jung intuited decades ago. The nervous system remembers what the mind forgets. Triggers, anxiety, and self-sabotaging patterns are often echoes of old pain, not flaws in our character. To begin true inner healing, we must first reconnect with the child within us. Not to dwell on the past, but to reclaim the parts of ourselves that were once silenced. The journey of self-love begins here, not through perfection, but through reconnection. By seeing, honoring, and gently healing the forgotten self, we begin to transform from the inside out. In the next section, we'll explore how this inner child dynamic continues to shape your adult life, and how Jung's teachings offer a map to break free. Within each of us lives a younger version that never fully grew up, a version that still holds on to the emotional intensity of our earliest memories. This is what Carl Jung referred to as the divine child, a psychological archetype representing innocence, creativity, vulnerability, and authenticity. But when this part of us is wounded, when its needs are unmet, its voice silenced, or its truth rejected, it doesn't simply disappear. It retreats, settles deep within the unconscious mind, and waits. We might think we've moved on. We become adults, we take on responsibilities, and we try to rationalize our struggles. Yet something inside us still reacts to pain like a frightened child. That's because trauma doesn't stay in the past, it becomes embedded in how we relate to the present. And the most persistent emotional patterns we can't explain, like the fear of abandonment, the inability to trust, the need to please others, or the overwhelming sense of unworthiness, are often signals from that hidden part of ourselves asking to be seen. Jung believed that the path to healing requires us to integrate the unconscious into consciousness. That includes facing not just the darkness we've suppressed, but also the innocence we've neglected. The inner child represents more than just emotional scars, it also carries our earliest truths about love, belonging, and identity. If those truths were shaped by rejection, instability, or emotional neglect, they become the silent blueprint for how we navigate adulthood. You might find yourself overreacting to criticism or shutting down emotionally when someone gets too close. You might notice a pattern of sabotaging relationships just as they begin to feel meaningful. These aren't random behaviors, they're protective strategies created long ago to survive emotional pain. And unless they are brought into awareness, they will continue to control your life from the background. The inner child doesn't speak with words. It expresses itself through triggers, sensations, emotional flashbacks, and sometimes through the subtle ache of emptiness. Every time you feel abandoned, even when no one has left you, every time you panic over something small, or feel paralyzed by self-doubt, there's a good chance the child within you is reacting, not your adult self. Healing begins when we stop judging these reactions and start listening to them. Instead of asking, "What's wrong with me?" we begin asking, "What happened to me?" That single shift in perspective changes the entire conversation. It opens space for compassion, for understanding, for acceptance. For many, the idea of reconnecting with the inner child feels abstract or even uncomfortable. But it doesn't require a dramatic act. Sometimes it begins with something as simple as recognizing how you speak to yourself when you make a mistake. Do you criticize yourself harshly, echoing the voices from your past? Or do you offer comfort, the way you would to someone you love? Carl Jung emphasized that transformation doesn't happen by bypassing the difficult parts of ourselves, it happens by including them. The child within you doesn't need to be fixed. She needs to be heard. And once she feels safe enough to express her needs, your life begins to shift in ways that feel profound but entirely natural. This journey is deeply personal, because no two inner children are wounded in the same way. Some may carry the pain of abandonment, others the weight of unrealistic expectations, emotional suppression, or growing up too fast. But no matter the wound, the solution begins with presence. When you choose to be present with your feelings, not to judge, but to observe, you create space for healing to begin. Modern psychology supports this approach. Studies in developmental trauma and attachment theory show that emotional regulation, self-worth, and relational security are all rooted in how safe we felt as children. When those needs weren't met consistently, we learn to adapt, often by disconnecting from our emotional truth. The adult we become is then shaped around coping mechanisms rather than authenticity. To undo this pattern, we must return, not to relive the pain, but to reclaim the parts of ourselves we were forced to abandon. That act alone is a declaration: you matter. Your feelings are valid. You are not alone anymore. And when the inner child begins to believe that, the adult finally feels free. Not all pain leaves visible scars. The deepest wounds are often the ones we carry silently, the ones no one else sees, yet shape everything we do. These wounds, formed during our early years, are not just memories from the past. They become the invisible scripts that guide our adult behavior, silently influencing how we love, how we react, how we set boundaries, or fail to. As children, we don't have the language to understand what's happening when we feel hurt, neglected, or rejected. Instead, we internalize those experiences. If a parent was emotionally unavailable, we don't think, "My caregiver has unmet needs." We think, "Something is wrong with me." That thought, that feeling, becomes a core belief. And it settles deep in the psyche, quietly shaping our self-worth. Carl Jung believed that when we repress painful experiences, they don't disappear, they migrate to the unconscious. There, they continue to live through our reactions, our fears, our defense mechanisms. That's why you might panic when someone pulls away emotionally. That fear isn't irrational, it's a reflection of an old wound resurfacing. One of the most common outcomes of early emotional wounds is the belief that we must earn love. If love was conditional, based on behavior, performance, or emotional suppression, we grow up believing that we are only worthy when we are perfect, pleasing, or useful. This can lead to overachieving, people-pleasing, or constantly seeking approval, even in relationships that drain us. Others may react in the opposite way. If we were punished or ignored for showing vulnerability, we might become emotionally distant as adults, avoiding intimacy at all costs. We may fear being seen, not because we don't crave connection, but because we learned long ago that emotional exposure equals pain. These are not conscious choices. They're unconscious survival strategies. The inner child learned to adapt to an unsafe emotional environment, and the adult continues the pattern, because it feels familiar, even when it's painful. This is one of the greatest paradoxes of trauma. The mind seeks familiarity, not safety. And what's familiar is often what hurt us in the first place. Jung referred to this as the complex, a cluster of thoughts, emotions, and memories that become activated when certain triggers are present. For example, if someone raises their voice, it might awaken the same fear you felt as a child when conflict meant danger. You're not responding to the current situation, you're reliving a past emotional memory. But because this process is unconscious, it feels automatic, uncontrollable, even shameful. That's why awareness is the first step toward healing. You can't change what you're not aware of. When you begin to notice these patterns, not with judgment, but with curiosity, you create a gap between stimulus and response. And in that space, you gain the power to choose differently. This awareness is not about blaming your past, but about understanding it. When we acknowledge that many of our adult struggles were once adaptive responses to childhood pain, we stop criticizing ourselves for being too sensitive or too needy. We begin to see those qualities as parts of us that needed care and never received it. The process of healing involves untangling these emotional patterns, looking at them not as flaws, but as signals. If you find yourself unable to say no, that's a sign your boundaries were not respected in childhood. If you constantly feel not good enough, you likely received conditional love. If you avoid intimacy, maybe it once felt unsafe to be emotionally open. Healing your inner child means giving new meaning to these patterns. Instead of avoiding conflict, you learn to express yourself without fear. Instead of seeking validation, you begin to offer compassion to yourself. Instead of fearing abandonment, you realize that your presence is enough, that you don't have to be anyone other than who you are to be loved. None of this happens overnight. These patterns have been with you for decades, and they don't dissolve with a single insight. But every time you notice one and respond with awareness instead of reactivity, you are interrupting the cycle. You are choosing healing. Carl Jung called this the process of individuation, the path of becoming whole. It begins when we stop running from our pain and start understanding it. The wounded child inside doesn't need to be silenced. She needs to be listened to. And when she finally feels safe, you begin to feel free. Healing the most fragile parts of ourselves is not about going back to the past with bitterness. It's about learning to respond to our inner wounds in a new way, with awareness, compassion, and presence. One of the greatest misunderstandings about healing the inner child is believing that we need to re-experience the pain to fix it. But the truth is, that child doesn't want you to relive the suffering, she wants to feel safe. She wants to be seen by someone who won't abandon her again. And now, that someone is you. Carl Jung taught that wholeness is not achieved by becoming perfect, but by embracing what we once rejected. That includes our fear, our shame, our sadness, and especially the vulnerability we were taught to hide. When we acknowledge these emotional layers with presence instead of judgment, something subtle but powerful begins to shift. The inner child, long silenced, begins to trust again. And in that trust, healing unfolds, not with force, but with gentleness. In Zen practice, there's a deep reverence for stillness, not just physical quiet, but the silence that emerges when we stop resisting our experience. Instead of trying to control or escape what we feel, we learn to observe it without attaching a story to it. This space, this mindful presence, creates the conditions for transformation. Because when you're not fighting your emotions, you can finally listen to what they're trying to tell you. The path of inner healing begins with small, conscious choices. For example, when a wave of self-criticism arises, maybe because you made a mistake or didn't meet someone's expectations, you can pause and notice the voice inside. Ask yourself, whose voice is this? Is it truly mine, or is it an echo from the past? Often, it's the inner child speaking from a place of fear. In that moment, you can begin to replace judgment with kindness. You can tell yourself what no one told you back then: it's okay. You don't need to be perfect to be loved. True self-love is not a feeling we chase. It's a daily act of recognition. It means standing beside ourselves even when we feel broken. It means making choices that protect our peace, rather than sacrificing our well-being for approval. It means forgiving ourselves not just for what we did, but for what we had to do to survive. Jung believed that healing required a dialogue between our conscious self and the parts we had buried. One way to open that dialogue is through inner conversation. You might close your eyes, take a breath, and imagine sitting beside your younger self. What does she look like? What is she feeling? Without forcing anything, allow a connection to form. Then, speak to her with the warmth and patience she always deserved. Tell her she's not alone anymore. That you're here, and you're not going anywhere. This may seem simple, even strange. But to the unconscious, it is deeply real. Every word you speak to yourself with tenderness repairs what was once fractured. You begin to rewrite the narrative, not by erasing the past, but by giving it new meaning. Zen wisdom teaches that suffering arises when we resist what is. The more we push away our pain, the more it controls us. But when we turn toward it, something shifts. Acceptance does not mean agreement. It means recognizing the truth of your experience without trying to change it in the moment. From that acceptance, new possibilities emerge. You begin to respond to life rather than react from old wounds. Self-love, in this context, is not a luxury. It's a necessity. Without it, we search endlessly for others to complete us, fix us, or fill the void we carry. But when we begin to meet our own emotional needs, we stop placing the burden of our healing on others. We take responsibility, not in a heavy way, but in an empowering one. Each time you choose presence over avoidance, compassion over judgment, you reinforce the message your inner child has always needed to hear: you matter. You are enough. I've got you now. And as that message sinks in, your relationship with yourself changes. You stop needing to perform for love. You begin to rest in your own worth. This journey requires patience. There will be moments of resistance. Times when old patterns feel easier than new choices. But if you stay with yourself, especially in the difficult moments, you'll notice something remarkable. That same child who once lived in fear begins to express joy again. She becomes playful, creative, open. Not because the past was erased, but because it no longer defines her. And in that space, you begin to discover who you truly are beneath all the layers. Somewhere deep inside you, the part that once felt forgotten is beginning to awaken. Not with fear, but with hope. Because for the first time, perhaps in a very long time, you've allowed yourself to listen, to really listen, to the story beneath your pain. And in that space of quiet recognition, a new chapter begins. Healing is not a finish line. It's a series of gentle choices you make every day. To speak kindly when it would be easier to criticize. To pause and feel when you'd rather run. To stay with yourself, especially in the moments when you've been taught to abandon who you are. You don't need to have all the answers. You don't need to fix everything at once. What matters is that you're here, now, taking this step. That you've chosen not to ignore the ache within you, but to explore it, with courage, with presence, with compassion. The world told you that being strong meant hiding your emotions. But what if true strength is the willingness to feel? To soften where you once hardened? To hold space for the child within you who never stopped hoping someone would stay? Let that someone be you. So before you move on with your day, take a breath. Place your hand over your heart. And whisper to that younger self. I see you. I hear you. I love you. You are safe now. If this message touched something inside you, something quiet, something real, then I invite you to stay on this journey with me. Subscribe to the channel, turn on the notification bell, and join a growing community of people choosing self-awareness over silence, and healing over hiding. Because you are not alone in this. And the more you return to yourself, the more whole you become. And now, I leave you with this question. What would change in your life if you treated yourself like someone worth fighting for? Let that answer guide your next step. I'll see you in the next video.